I know you must all be buzzing with ideas and excitement. I ask that you take those ideas and hold on to them as we move to our closing panel for the event. NCES Commissioner Dr. Peggy Carr's final panel, Implications and Imperatives for Equity, Opportunity, and Achievement in Mathematics, will feature some leading scholars and educators in mathematics education. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Carr.
Hello, my name is Peggy Carr, and welcome to the closing panel of the IES Mathematics Summit. I want to use our time this afternoon to talk about the implications and imperatives of equity, opportunity, and achievement in mathematics. I can't think of a better way to bring our 3-day conference to a close. In our conversations, my 5 guests and I will summarize the important issues that have been discussed over the past 3 days, beginning with our first keynote guest and former astronaut, Dr. Bernard Harris. He challenged us to help all children realize their infinite potential, with particular dedication to children who are the furthest from opportunity. Those were his words, and I hope you will take them to heart as you go back to your everyday lives. We also heard from districts, states, policymakers. They demonstrated their resilience and provided us hope. They showed us, though, that hope isn't enough. It takes hard work and a focus on improving how we can teach each other and our students and support their learning and development. Across all 3 days, teachers, researchers, and teacher educators challenged and inspired us to try new things based on their research and experience, and STEAM career professionals and classroom teachers demonstrated what happens in classrooms and how we can prepare students for successful careers in high-demand fields. And now I'm joined by 5 remarkable individuals. These 5 panelists are the best group of people I can think of to reflect on what we've heard over the past 3 days and to explore how we will move with optimism, hope, and knowledge. Now I would like to ask each of my guests to introduce themselves and tell us what they think equity is for us in this context. Equity and access, to be precise, in mathematics education. I'm going to start with Dr. Nathan Alexander. Nathan.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you've had a great summit and that you've enjoyed the sessions. Just echoing some of Dr. Carr's words and really thinking about the work that we do. A lot of my work as a professor of mathematics and education is helping students to think more about computational skills. I've spent a lot of time working with teachers, students, and community organizations. And as I do that work, a lot of the ways that I think about equity, specifically as it relates to math education and access, really requires us to take a zoom out view and really think big picture. And I'd like to think about 3 other words in context with that. We have the term equality, which often sort of thinks in mathematics about just equal access to things across groups. And then you have terms like social justice or just justice. So when I think about equity specifically, it really creates a trajectory towards what's possible and ensuring that we're not just giving students the same access to things, but we're really thinking historically about what is fair access, what is equitable. And as we do that, how are we being mindful of the historical structures and the current social dynamics that really position students as having the opportunity and access to learn mathematics. I think we all can agree that every student deserves equal access to mathematics. And in doing that, I encourage us all to think about how history has impacted and continues to impact the ability for all of our students to access mathematics and mathematics education. Thank you, Dr. Clark.
Thank you, Nathan. I don't know if you saw it, but there were a lot of heads nodding. And now we're going to turn to Dr. Robert Berry.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Berry, and I'm the Dean of College of Education at the University of Arizona. And much of my work overlaps significantly with all of our panelists. Much of my work is sitting in the space of access and equity, but most recently my work is focused on these issues around social justice and justice in mathematics. I've had the pleasure to serve as president of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. And in doing so, as I think about access and equity in mathematics, I think about the experiences of learners in classrooms. And what I mean by that, I want every student to experience joy, wonder, and beauty. And when we think about joy, wonder, and beauty in mathematics, we can think about different outcomes that are associated with those terms. But if we want all students to experience joy, wonder, and beauty, I think we have to think about equity from a structural position. Do students have access to high quality teachers? Are students' basic needs being met, not only within classrooms, but also more broadly within their communities and how communities serve students? But I also want to think about equity when I mention community as being communal. So how are the assets in communities accessed to meet the needs of students? And so bringing in the community, being communal about the work that we do in mathematics education. So it really is that, structural, community, and joy, wonder, and beauty. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I wrote that down. Joy, wonder, and beauty. Nice quote. Now we're going to turn to a good friend and colleague of mine that I've known for decades, Phil Daro.
Thank you, Peggy. It's always tough to follow Robert. I applaud everything he said. I'd like to zero in on changes that need to be made in schools. And changes do need to be made if we want different results. Two things. One, when we make changes, we may make things better for some and worse for others. And we have to think in a more differentiated way about the students we're trying to help. So in particular, students who have aspirations for STEM, including students who we recruit and develop those aspirations, because historically, those aspirations wouldn't develop based on how we've treated them. Those students benefit from some things which will hurt students whose aspirations are non-STEM. For example, they aspire to careers in law, politics, nursing, and any number of wonderful professions and occupations. And I'll give an example. I think all students have their opportunities increased when they learn about functions and their graphs. Their opportunities are increased when they learn about the role of computation and modeling data. However, when we make all students master factoring polynomials does not increase the opportunity for non-STEM students. It is necessary for STEM students, but it becomes a barrier for non-STEM students. So we have to be good engineers in the way we design the improvements so that we benefit different groups who have different aspirations. And we have to be mindful the aspirations have been corrupted by historical structures, racist structures in society. And the second point relates to that opportunity has priors. There are prior opportunities that some people had and some people didn't. And we have to take those priors into account when we're focusing on future opportunities. So we can't act like everybody had the same start. So when we're looking, for example, the talent pool for STEM fields does not develop enough of the talent that's there in marginalized communities. We've got to do something that's active to develop that talent, to ignite those aspirations, and then support them. So this is the connection between prior and future opportunities. we've got to do a lot of work to connect those two, including how we structure the opportunities and how we invest in support. So I'm going to stop with that.
Thank you, Phil. You know, we're going to have a segment later on new normals. I'm hoping you're going to continue that conversation. But now we're going to turn to Dr. Donna Lee. Hi, Donna.
Hi there. How are you, Peggy? Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And just a couple of things. It's interesting at the very onset in your opening statement, you talked about we can't just hope. And I'm always one of those people who says hope is not a strategy. Hope is a feeling. It's not a strategy to move from where we are today to where we expect to be. So I appreciated that because it ties into one of the philosophies that I have in terms of education. So I'm currently serving as a superintendent of schools in the suburbs of Chicago. I've done high school and now I'm doing pre-K through 8. So I've had the opportunity to do the whole pre-K through 12 gamut. And I've also served as a professor at a couple of universities in the Chicagoland area. And in addition to that, I serve as the vice president of the State Board of Education for the state of Illinois. So I'm on the ground in the trenches. I'm at the high level, really looking at what do we need to do in order to assure that all of our students are being successful. And I had the opportunity for about a little over 20 years to serve on the board of directors for the National Council of Supervisors of Mathematics. So this has been an ongoing passion of mine in terms of equity and expectations for our children of color, in particular, children who have been marginalized in whatever ways. And so we work with TOTOs, different organizations to really ensure that we're at the forefront about what does this look like. So when I think about this idea of defining equity and access, a lot of people show there's a graphic where there's students or children standing and there's a fence and you're trying to look at the baseball game, right? And then you have the next slide where you have children who have different support systems so they can see over the fence. So for me, equity is the fence isn't there.
Yeah.
That's how I define equity and access is there's no fence, we've removed the barriers, and every child has the opportunity to access what's going on at their level, wherever they might be. And that, when we talked about, Phil was talking about the barriers and the systems and structure, a fence is a system and a structure. That's what that represents. So I think this conversation today is really about how do we take away those fences that create barriers that should not be there for children. And then the other part of that becomes how do we actually accept the fact that those barriers exist and they've been systemic for decades upon decades, accept that, and then say we as adults will make the decision to remove those barriers and provide the opportunities for our children. So that's my definition. I'm a very visual person. So for me, that's equity and access. We have to figure out how do we remove the fence so everybody has access to the field at whatever level that they're at.
Donna, I saw a cartoon that describes exactly what you're describing today, with the fence going and underneath it said justice.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah,
And
that's what I heard. Just heard you describe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And thank you for joining us. I know it was a last minute thing. We're so grateful.
I'm always happy to
have
join
you.
Thank you.
But we have one more. Cathery, yay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carr. Deeply honored to be here. I'm an assistant professor at UT Austin, but I would say what grounds my work is my days as an elementary school teacher. I worked in bilingual settings, teaching in Mandarin, Chinese, and Spanish. As a classroom teacher, I visited actually over 300 homes, and my students, their families and community members, they came into the math classroom and they co-taught with me. We talked about the mathematics that takes place in homes and communities, from braiding hair, baking bread, to carpentry, shopkeeping, to examining gentrification of affordable housing. I shared this because I checked in with a few of my students, now in their 20s and 30s, and their families, and asked, what would they like me to share here? So my definition of equity and access builds from them and the need to critically examine current equity ideologies of inclusion and access. They shared, and I felt the same, we often position equity and access as an outcome or product to be given to students and teachers. It's something we give, in which our teachers and our students don't actually have a decision on what that should look like in process. Instead, we would argue, so I speak on the collective of we, because they are with me. I feel them giving me the strength. Public speaking makes me nervous. We would argue that equity and access should be a process in which those most impacted should be a part of the decision-making in how equity is defined and enacted. For example, when we think about authority, like access to math content in the classroom, does the student have math authority in the classroom to determine how access is provided? Or are they moved into tier 3 intervention and outside the classroom and they have no say? This is the same for teachers. Are teachers and communities, family and local community, given authority in the type of support they are provided? Are we responsive to their expertise, their needs, and their contexts? I want to go back to what Dr. Robert Berry has said, because we need to uplift beautiful words. Access and equity is being communal in the work, and who gets to be in the table to define it in action.
Dr. Ye, we're going to have a segment later that talks about community and how communities can help us achieve math people, math thinkers, and I'm really hoping you'll tell us a little bit more about your experience. But now we're going to move into those segments, and we're going to start with one on equity and access, and that really sort of defined a lot of what you've already said, but we want to hear more. I have a few questions. I know you have a lot to say. I'm just going to say all of the questions, and then you guys just jump in. What does access mean? And what do students need to have access to? What does access mean in the post-pandemic world? That's something I think Phil said a little bit about. I really want to know more about what you all think on that topic. What should teachers and practitioners provide to ensure equitable access to mathematics? How do school communities, Dr. Ye, this one's going to be for you, create school norms of equity and access? How do we live our beliefs? So let's hear what you guys have to say. Speak up.
Well, I'll jump in first. The first thing that I think of when we talk about that whole bank of questions is making sure that our teachers and our people in the classroom are understanding things like mathematical practices, that they're actually able to incorporate it, whether it doesn't matter what I teach, I should be doing mathematical practices across the board, because that really does teach young people how to think, how to interpret what their understandings are. So that's my number one, is making sure that we as leaders are providing that support for staff members. And then the other part too is, just because children maybe don't speak, the English may not be their first language, that doesn't mean that they are good mathematicians. Right. And so respecting and understanding how we need to be approaching and providing resources so that we can actually allow children to showcase what they know. That's part of the access. Just because you come and you don't speak English doesn't mean that you didn't come here already knowing a great deal about mathematics, which is really a universal language. So how do we then ensure that we as the adults are providing support for those young people so that we can access what they know? So those are kind of my two biggies right out the gate, is mathematical practices across the board that all teachers understand and know how to use and develop and facilitate them, and then making sure that we're accessing what our young people already know so that we can move them to the next level.
Right. Thank you, Donna.
Sure.
Others?
Well, I'll jump in the sense that, I appreciate the conversation on mathematics practices. But also, what I want to add is, my early work as a researcher, I focus on Black boys. And oftentimes I say, I believe in the brilliance of Black children. And so how does that brilliance show up in our mathematics classrooms? And how does that intersect with practices that we see, particularly practices in classrooms? So I'll bring up one. When we talk about mathematical discourse, kids bring their communities to our classrooms, right? And the way that we may engage in discourse may look different than that may look different across different communities. And how do we honor that, how people engage in discourse and representing their thinking? Understanding that is significant mathematics that come from that. Children are incredibly creative. And we can operate from the disposition that is foundational, that children are brilliant and children are creative, and allow that brilliance and creativity to flourish in our classrooms. Because sometimes our practices don't allow that to happen, right?
Right.
Sometimes we diminish that, right? And so the idea is how to create opportunities for engagement, which will be, in that space of discourse, and how do we allow the diversity of engagement that happens in our classroom. Again, I want to go back to this idea of joy, wonder, and beauty, because the way that we engage in classroom, that sense of joy, that sense of confidence that kids bring to the classroom, you can see very young kids with that excitement and confidence, and somewhere along their pathways, that same excitement and confidence we don't see. So often I wonder what's happened to students. And so the idea is acknowledging that students bring not only themselves, but they bring their community to our classroom. And somehow we have to honor that as a part of our practices.
Robert, Phil, I didn't mean to jump in front of you. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to give an example of what Robert was talking about. One of the essential things about mathematics is mathematical argument. And you see it in the mathematical practices, and it's really at the heart of mathematics. What's a good mathematical argument? If students are going to learn that central part of mathematics, they have to have the experience of being in the argument. And we know that there are big cultural differences in the argument dialects. People argue differently depending on their backgrounds. There are big differences in gender, in ethnicity, in all kinds of ways. So as a teacher in a classroom, if we want a culture where every child is encouraged to argue mathematically, we have to be welcoming to all the different styles of argument. And we have to appreciate that encountering different styles can produce shyness or even anxiety or anger in students who aren't used to it coming from other students. So managing that is kind of essential in a math classroom. And it's not simple. It's not just a matter of being nice. Right. You've got to actually have what Robert keeps talking about, the joy and wonder. You want to get at the truth, which is what argument helps you do, and what mathematics help you do. And that appetite for finding out what's true and using math to decide what's true, and using argument as a method, that's what will sparkle the culture in the classroom. But you've got to welcome all the different styles.
Phil, I was thinking about the PISA assessment as you were talking, because PISA, 70 countries, they're thinking very concertedly about culture and how it impacts students' access to their items, even their math items, not just their reading items. And we're not doing that here in the United States. And we have a very diverse country, as diverse as many of the countries that are participating in PISA. You're so right about that. Cathery, did I jump in front of you?
You didn't jump in front of me. I'm just listening and reflecting. I think throughout the 3 days, and then particularly here now, we're really clear about our beliefs, that we believe all kids are brilliant. I think what we need to reflect on, does it show up in our actions? And we're naming a lot of classroom practices, but I think there's an importance for us to unpack our norms and how even when we say we believe all kids are brilliant, there is clearly differential definition what access means. I can say for myself, my area of focus is on the intersections of race, ability, and space. So who gets to be, if you have, and I can say myself, I have a child with disabilities, but her being an Asian American and being neurodiverse is very different than if she was a Black boy. So I think for us to name out how that takes place, and also how, because of that, how access is perceived differently. So in the field right now, there is a large difference between what we think access means in the field of special education and math education, despite it's all about mathematics, right? We would never say, I'm just going to call it out, you're Chinese, you should do math this way. That would be called racist.
Yeah.
But we're totally okay saying these kids with a disability, there's 13 categories of disabilities. And so this assumption that they all fit into one group should do math this way, without attending to, if any of us go back to our own K-12 experiences, who are tracked in high ability math classes, who are in the AP classes, who are weeded out of general education classrooms and pulled out for tier 3 intervention. It is linked to race, class, and gender. So I completely agree that it's situated in classrooms, but oftentimes teachers don't even have that choice. So are we connecting our beliefs of children's brilliance to attending the fact that children don't need to be fixed, but our learning environment clearly does, from classrooms to schools, to assessment policies, to district policies and statewide.
Thank you, Dr.
Cathery's note. Cathery's note makes me think about some of the work that Vanessa Siddle-Walker did on these early schools, where we're getting a really in-depth look at Black teachers in segregated and often horrendous sort of conditions, you know, in these periods that we reflect on. And despite all of that, what we're seeing are these teachers do exactly what Cathery and others, Dr. Berry and Boyle, have talked about as it relates to not just differentiating instruction, but really being mindful of what's happening inside of the classroom and outside the classroom. And I think one of the questions that you asked, Dr. Carr, was like, how do we live our beliefs? And I wonder again, like as teachers, I've learned so much by considering this historical work and these historical perspectives. It's almost as if the answers are there waiting for us to just read and engage them again, not come up with a new framework or a new way of thinking. It's like, no, the history books often show us exactly how to live our beliefs. And I think as teachers and educators, maybe some of the questions like, are we willing to step into those beliefs and begin to live them?
Right.
And like Cathery said, our students are not the ones. It's often us as the adults who have to really get the courage and speak up in order to make those things come true.
You know, Nathan, I'm reminded from your comments of some struggles that NAEP had at one point getting Puerto Rico to students' scores to scale on the NAEP assessment. We couldn't figure out why we were not able to stabilize their scores. They just were not having a good time of accessing the NAEP items. They were not able to access the items. So we went into the items, Phil, you might remember this, and we pulled out construct irrelevant variants, those things that had nothing to do with mathematics. And lo and behold, these students had greater access to these items. They scored higher on the math assessment because we took out those things that had nothing to do with the domain of interest. So we have to think about what access means, I think, on a number of levels. Nice discussion, I think. More to be said. But I want to move now to another topic. You know, as we come out of this COVID context, people are calling it post-COVID or post-pandemic. You've heard this term new normal. and the new normal of education and what it means for teaching and learning. So I have a series of questions in this area, and love to hear what your thinking might be for equity and access as you think about this new normal concept. What lessons did you learn from the disruptive learning that happened during COVID? What can you think of that maybe there's something to be learned from that experience, good or bad? What can we learn from other countries in defining the new normal? Cathery, I heard you talk about Asian countries. Some of the top scoring countries in the world are Asian countries. Love to hear what you think about what we can learn from other cultures.
I was wondering if I can let Dr. Leek go first, because I do this work in a research space and go into classrooms and schools and check in with my students. But Dr. Leek works with school systems and has more knowledge than I do. So I would love to build from her, but I would love for her to center her and the challenging work she does, if that's okay.
Donna, you heard it first.
First, I want to acknowledge a couple of things that are prevalent in our vernacular across the country. One is learning loss and disruption of learning. And the thing that I think was the greatest lesson that we learned is we didn't lose learning. What we lost maybe was teaching certain standards, but teaching our young people about resilience, about the transition, getting our staff to understand how, because I know in the state of Illinois, we close on Monday, the 16th of March, and my district opened up on Tuesday, the 17th of March, with every child at home, ready to go. It was seamless for us. And part of the reason it was seamless is because one of the lessons learned is that we as educators have to be ready to pivot. We talk about equity and access. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The district that I serve is predominantly low income. We have homes that have 10 or 11 children in the house. So that means they didn't have internet access. So it means you have to pivot. And that's how we continue with equity and access for our young people. The other part too, that was really, for me, in terms of understanding, our children learned how to learn differently than what they had done before. And that, to me, that's not a loss, that's a gain. Yes, we got them back into the traditional, they're back in school, but now we communicate with parents differently. The communication with families is different. The expectations of our staff is different. What that looks like in terms of, you can't tell me that a child is not able to learn and do and be able to move forward, because we now have access to so many different things we didn't have before. So as much as it really was, it was a strain on everyone, at the end of the day, the lessons that we learned was we have no excuse for any single child not to be successful, period. There's no excuse. When I talked about removing the fence and the barriers, that's what I'm talking about. When we send home children, there's no reason that when we brought children back into our school buildings, that we could not be ready for them to meet them where they are, regardless of who they are, regardless of what they walk in the door. When we brought children back in, we talked about it being acceleration of learning of standards. We didn't talk about it as a loss of learning. We talked about, we're bringing you back in to accelerate these standards that we need to focus on. But my kindergartners learn how to type. They learn how to do Google Classroom. Right now they can get in. Yesterday I had a parent coffee. I had one of my preschoolers who was navigating my computer during the parent coffee. Those are skill sets that young people learned during the pandemic that we did not necessarily understand that was the learning that was going on. So yeah, we brought them back in. The academic components we're working through, but when I look at even defining, I don't even call it the new normal. This just is normal. It's 2023. It's not 1953. This is where we are. So yes, there was a pandemic. okay, and I mean, we've been doing education for 400 years here. So the pandemic was what, 2 years? We don't have any excuses for us not to be projecting into where we are today. So I'm very passionate about this. I get riled up when people talk about my children having learning loss, because our test scores actually went up out of the pandemic, because our team was focused, and parents were in the background listening to what their children were doing, and they were jumping into the class. Hey, is there something I could do to help? That's community. I mean, there's so many components that we learned during the pandemic that just really made a huge difference. So, and I'll let other people talk, but Cathery, you're right. I was in it. I've been living in it. And this, for me, this isn't a new normal. It's just our normal for 2023. This is just where we are.
A testament to boots on the ground, Donna. I can see why Cathery ceded her time to you.
And I'm glad to build on from it. I know you had asked about international comparisons between our test scores to, for example, China. As we know, context matters, right? Like, we know that we can't just look at test scores without looking at the context in which our students are in, the pathways in which they've had a chance to engage in. So then we also need to go back to what Dr. Alexander talked about, the social historical context. If we go back, we think about how have measurements or conceptions of ability been used throughout our historical legacy? Conceptions of ability was used to justify slavery. It was used to justify why certain people could come into the US or not. And in the last 60, 70 years, to justify why we should continue tracking ability grouping and continue segregated practices after desegregation. So I share that because I want to go back to what Dr. Leek had said about the need to pivot. We have to pivot. There is no going back to normal, because what has been normal through our legacy of math education has been problematic by nature. And when I think about what I wanted Dr. Leek to go first, and also building the work that Dr. Robert Berry had published recently on catalyzing, like success stories and catalyzing change, we should look at pockets of success and where success has been done, and then think about what that means. And what I've done in analyzing what Dr. Leek has said and what Dr. Robert Berry has done recently, I think is 3 things. One, we know that teachers' instructional practice matters, but it's shaped by teachers' beliefs, knowledge, and prior experiences. But as well, we can't just put it on teachers, but organizational systems and processes. Second, I wanted Dr. Leek to go first because leadership matters. Like, we need to bring more leaders in the room who can make decisions, from superintendents to policymakers. I hope lots of policymakers are in the room here. And then last, I would say, we arrive at better understanding solutions when those most impacted by these problems get to take part in the processes and decision making. We cannot be making decisions without asking those who are most impacted to get to take part in the planning, not checking in to see how they feel about it after, right? We keep gathering data on what's happened to them, but not bring them in as part of decision making.
Bold language and bold thinking, Cathery, go together. Thank you for that.
I want to.
I know I just talked. I'm sorry. I just had to add to Cathery's really quick. And that is, Cathery, you are right. If you go back and look at the historical perspective of education in America, it was set up for originally, so you would have the laboring and the learned. And African Americans were not included in either one of those groups. And then even as you fast forward, the laborers were supposed to learn to be obedient and quiet. And so if you look at our system, that's why I say this is not a new normal. This has to be the normal, because that system didn't work for children of color. So I just wanted to, I'm sorry, Phil, I didn't mean to jump in. I just had to add to what Cathery was saying.
No, that's fine. I want to express a worry about the arrival of technology in our classrooms and our schools. I think Donna gave some good examples of how it can help. And it's interesting, most of the examples you cited, Donna, were about communication. and the way technology can be used by all parties to improve communication. And if you look at the way technology is used outside of school, that is the primary use. It's communication. If you see kids on their own on their screen, what are they doing? They're broadcasting their person, their ideas, their words to the audience out there, to friends, whatever it is. It's amplified their voice, not quieted their voice. And this very human core motivation of what it means to be listened to is also at the heart of learning. We learn by being listened to. And if the technology improves my opportunity to be listened to, good. But if it shuts me up and makes me sit there and listen, look at the screen and listen to other people talking, and it diminishes my opportunity to be listened to, bad. So all this enthusiasm we're hearing about AI and all of that, it could be good, but it could be bad. It could just reinforce the bad structural things we're already used to. And I think the key to telling good from bad in this mysterious new environment is it increasing the opportunity to be listened to?
Yeah. The fears and woes of AI. People need to think about that, what it means. A lot of good, but a lot of challenges too, if we really understand what it could do. Robert, were you going to jump in? Nathan.
Yeah, I can defer to Nathan if Nate, you want to go ahead and.
Yeah, it was really a quick comment to build on some of the comments about technology. One of the things that I learned and I have been seeing more is just where access becomes a more dominant part of the conversation. And so I'm thinking about students that might have different needs. And so what we see now on things like Zoom are requests for closed captioning. And I think regardless of sort of how we feel about the technologies or the new things, I think it's forced us to all think a little bit more about the conversations around access and diversity to all of our students. And that's been one of the things that I've become more aware of as a teacher as it relates to sort of the pre-pandemic or pre-2020 years and the post-2020 years.
Well, I will add, part of this is what I want to say, continue to preach. I mean, this feels uplifting. It feels warm in the way that we're having this conversation, because I think it speaks to, a broader issue around why being in community with people about the issues that are connected to mathematics, more broadly around how communities kind of access and create opportunities. And so the notion of how technology plays in that, but, the idea of, I think about needs, I think about students' basic needs, I think about teachers' basic needs in this space, and how has the pandemic, supported that or even disrupted some of that as well. And so, and then also thinking about, as I mentioned earlier, around this whole notion of, as Phil said, who gets to be heard, right? And I think about how students are using social media to elevate themselves, elevate their voices, and oftentimes we see that as a social thing, but it can be a learning opportunity if we think about how we can do that. And oftentimes this is what the technology, even, I would say in the context in which we're living now, it is that those connections and the need for connections, whatever social media kind of outlet or app that people may connect to. But also one of the things that is resonating with me is students and people get to critique the world in which they're living, and often reading the world in which they live in and giving voice to that. And how do we use mathematics in a way that allows them to be critical, allows them to critique, but also allows them to understand what math do I need to know to do the thing I want to do and to say the thing I need to say, right? And if we can create that opportunity for students to say that math can be a tool for change and not a thing to do, why do we learn mathematics? We learn mathematics as a tool for change, a tool for impact. This is where I see us in this moment that we live now, because I think people are asking those questions, and they're asking questions, what do I need to learn to do that thing I need to do?
Yeah.
And that's critical.
Robert, your comments there represent a nice segue into our last section, our talk, our chat on resilience and hope. Hope isn't just a bumper sticker, right? I mean, we need to make it into something that's actionable, not just words. So let's close by talking a little bit about resilience and hope in our lives, and so that we can give our children some sense of a future and what it could be. What can we do so that we're not having the same conversation 10 years from now? What role, Cathery, I talked about this earlier because I knew this was coming. What role can the community and the school play? What can we all do to lift our students up and to help identify where resilience can be? Because it could be amongst those where we least expect to find it. Exemplars, models that can be emulated. What do you think?
Am I going first? It seems like
Yes.
Okay. It's always nerve-wracking to go first. Okay. First of all, I think us having this conversation is central. I know there's a lot of conversation about technology being good or bad, and it's both. And I think in the chat, Dr. Alexander and I were talking about the term of an intersectional approach to access, right? But I want to hit upon this idea that how can we continue to broaden these spaces, challenge silos within schools and classrooms, communities, and extend this work and make it something that's concrete and a regular part of practice. I'm going to give you one concrete example because I feel that part of my role here is just to tell stories that I've learned from others. So recently I was hanging out in a classroom. This is a teacher that Miss Suzanne Huerta. She teaches 4th and 5th grade in a self-contained classroom in the community where I grew up, Buena Park, California, okay, right next to Knott's Berry Farm. Worked at the mall. My husband and I had our first date there in that community. And I was with her because people told me I have to visit her. And what was happening wasn't just exemplar in what she was doing in her classroom, where the students were engaging in grade level math. And we know that students who are in self-contained classrooms are identified as being at least 2 grade levels below grade level, right? They're engaging in grade level mathematics in their own ways. So honoring the way in which they were doing mathematics, but also tending to their access needs in which their communication preference may not be verbal. But what was exemplar, thinking about the ways in which we're building community that honors an expansive way of thinking of math, the principal, Stephanie, I want to name her out, the principal of the school, Stephanie Williamson, was bringing in the general ed counterparts to come and observe her classroom and to practice listening to the kids and observing what they were doing to disrupt their notions and their deficit thinking about children who are multilingual, students with disabilities, students whose communication preference may be different than ours. I want to name that as an example because they're doing exactly what we're doing here. How can we center on stories of excellence in which we're learning together and disrupting this ideology that some kids can do math and some can't? If we know all kids are brilliant, what are we doing intentionally to bring spaces where everyone can come together to learn together?
Thank you, Cathery. Others, jump in, please.
I'll jump in on this idea of hope. And the first thing is I just want to talk a little bit about resilience. And one of the things that we as adults is that we're resilient. We can make it through certain circumstances and we just persevere and get there. And I think it needs to be said that our children did not ask to be resilient, but they have been. And it's been remarkable to see that. And what I've learned about young people is their resilience a lot of times is greater than those of our adults. They take where we are and they just keep it moving and keep it going. And so the idea of hope for me, it's really, it's a state of mind. It's this optimistic state of mind that believes that we have these expectations and they can happen. And so when I talk about, and with my staff in particular, I say hope isn't the strategy. The strategy is what are the actions that we're going to take that will instill that optimistic state of mind within our staff and our students and our community so that they know that we actually have action steps that will fulfill the outcome this positive outcome. So as we're talking about mathematics education, the question for me becomes, as a leader in a school district in the state, is what action steps are we putting in place that are tangible, that people can see, that show that we're thinking ahead so that they know there's a reason to have an optimistic state of mind and that there's a reason for us to have that feeling that we are going to have a positive outcome. So I think they go hand in hand. You can't talk about hope without having an action plan that will instill hope. So that's where I land in that conversation connected to mathematics education.
So for me, this is incredible. And when I say incredible, because, I will kind of talk about something that's been associated with me for a long time. And if you've heard me speak before, you've heard me talk about this notion of truly wonderful and getting better. And so let me just kind of provide some background around that. I founded a program called Math Men in Mission when I lived in Charlottesville, Virginia. But the tagline of truly wonderful and getting better was before that, when I was a student at the University of North Carolina. And so when I was in Charlottesville, we worked with the young men. I would ask them every morning, how are you doing? And the expected response is, I am truly wonderful and getting better. Then my follow-up question would be, well, tell me something truly wonderful about yourself. And the reason why we did that is because how often are people asked to talk about their truly wonderfulness, right? And then after they say something truly wonderful about themselves, the next question would be, what are you working on right now to get better? And so the idea, to me, that's about identity and agency. And the idea is, and as a teacher, I learn an incredible amount about the students in which I serve. I learn about their hope, I learn about who they are, how they see themselves in the world, in terms of how their truly wonderfulness, but also the thing that they identify with what they're working on and getting better. And so when I think about truly wonderful and getting better, I do think about how do we kind of scale that up in the work that we're doing in mathematics education. How do we think about, not only at the individual level with the students in which I work, but also at a systemic level when we think about, what are some of the truly wonderful things about the work that we're doing, while at the same time being critical, right? Because there's a lot of critiques in this space. And then the idea, what can we do to get better? So I think about, how are we developing partnership with families and communities? How are we developing policies that disrupt some of the things that have negative implications for teachers, students, and families? I mean, those are tangible things that we can work on in evaluation of our policies, developing partnership, creating, the things that we think about classroom practices that support students and teachers and things of the nature, the stories that we tell the stories we tell matter, right? And so, and the stories that we tell about classrooms and teachers and students matter as well. So for me, it really goes back to the thing I always associate with and have been associated with is being truly wonderful and what are we working on to get better.
You know, Robert, as you were talking, I was thinking about the results from the national assessment, the nation's report card, when we released them. And when we get to the results by race ethnicity, and we sort of rank order where students are, you know who's at the bottom? Black boys. And it really concerns me that I'm always saying the same thing to the same people. And they need to hear something different. We need to have stories of resilience. They need to be told that they can do this, and we need to keep our standards high because it is possible. Resilience exists. You know, I've had an opportunity to write down 2 interesting quotes from you today. I am truly getting better. I'm truly wonderful. Is that what you said? I'm truly wonderful and getting better. I wrote that down because I'm going to use that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I think about, you know, those results with Black boys at the bottom, you know, and the question I would ask, you know, and always will kind of ponder about if we're getting the same results, you know, what does that say about the structure of the system we're operating?
Right.
That's why I wanted
Well,
to
you
jump
know,
in.
90 schools do exist. 90% minority, 90% low income, and 90% proficient. They're out there. And there are children that look like you and me in those schools. So it exists. Nathan.
Yeah, just jumping in on you know, if we continue to see these results historically, you know, these questions about systems, part of my thought as it relates to hope and resilience, and I think this has been said, is sort of looking at these exemplars. We have programs like the Algebra Project, the Young People Project, being bridged into advanced mathematics that are showing us that a lot of what we tend to believe about assessments and assessment outcomes when they are disaggregated by ethnicity, race, country, don't tell the full picture. And I point to the Algebra Project and Bob Moses to sort of say that part of, I think, one of our goals, I believe, as math educators and just educators and people in general, is we have to have a politics. And so a lot of people like to talk about the Algebra Project and Flagway and the great things that it's doing. But many people forget that Bob Moses was working with Fannie Lou Hamer and had a politic. I mean, that politic was really rooted in the community, and it was really rooted in parents. And that is where I believe math education specifically has lost its way. We talk about communities, but are we with communities? And so I think I'm just sort of like maybe a theme of my notes and sort of my thinking is, you know, when we look at these figures that we like to cite or that we like to mention, they're actual practices. When we look at SNCC that Bob Moses was a part of, when we read those texts, we see that like a teacher would leave their school building and go to a SNCC meeting. I mean, educators were involved in those processes. And I wonder often if we're overridden by a lot of the stats and these deficit ways of thinking. Is the other part missing is that we don't have a politics that we're willing and to really speak about. And I think part of a future for math ed is for us to really be mindful of the reality that our world has been structured by the needs and the normalization of white children and families. And that often when we use terms like people of color, and so I'm thinking about Cathery's comments earlier, that even when we look at different and racial ethnic groups, there's context there. And so when we're grouping people as people of color, this sort of from a political lens is normalizing white children and families. And as we do that, how is that part of this defining and lessening about hope and resilience? Because when you look at the studies, I remember one of the first studies that I read as a graduate student was Dr. Berry's work on young Black boys. And it was like, this is here. And it was those stories that reminded me that it's not all about the numbers. And I think that was a politic that I was reading. It's like, here's what's happening in these classrooms. Here's what's happening in the communities. That was a really impactful study. Thank you, Dr. Berry, for that study, by the way. So many of us in that ed have really benefited from, I think, multiple stories. And so I like to sort of offer to the audience and to our conversations that it has to be a both and when it comes to quantitative and qualitative work, when it comes to hope and resilience, that a really big part of that is reading between the lines. And I think reading between the lines comes as a result of having a foundational politic that you're willing to stand on with your work.
It's not just about numbers, right? You really have to have the context, the qualitative data, the stories behind it. Phil, you're going to close us out.
It's important to remember that we have had successes, and we've had many, and we've had them for a long time. We tend to ignore them because we're so desperate to make things better. But it's important for people to have hope, to see it can be done. So just from the standpoint of NAEP, at 4th and 8th grade, every decade was better than the previous decade until this last decade. And yet the story out there was things are getting worse and schools are going downhill. But in math, we're going uphill. We've been, and quite a bit, it accumulated to be quite a bit. And that's true for all groups, which means that the gap didn't close the way we wanted it to. But all groups grew. Some states do a much better job than other states, no matter what question you're asking. What someone asked me, what's the best state educationally based on NAEP if I'm a Latino student? What state am I going to do the best in? And I'm in California, and I said it's not California. But then if you look in the NAEP in the database, which you can do, you can ask and answer that kind of question. And this is across populations and subpopulations, so you lose context. That's true. But we need to have these success stories as part of the discussion and not just be zeroing in on what we need to do to fix things.
Bill, can I ask a question? Maybe this is a learning moment for me. As we sort of look at the state data and we lose further context, how do we sort of, to this hope and resilience around your question around, hey, if we want to send a student to a certain area or school, in what ways might we bridge context with sort of like the needs of a nation, for lack of better words? Like, we do need numbers, we do need to think about the policies, but I'm, as a new person in math ed field, I'm learning from all of the experience on this call. I would be interested in sort of how we keep that, given the damaging and deficit ways that the stats have been used to really, tell that negative and lose that hope and resilience when it comes to those narratives.
Yeah. Donna, I know we said we were going to close out, but Donna, you've seen it all. You have a very, very diverse population of students that you're serving. Can you speak on that as we close out this section?
I think that's an excellent question. And I actually think it's a good place to close because it really is about action. And it's about meeting not just students, but staff where they are and bring them up to speed, because sometimes we forget that because we love math, we're in the math community, in the math world. All of our staff who are in classrooms are not in that same vein. So it really is, it's a matter of us at the local levels, at the state level and national level, providing contextual support for teachers who are actually in the classrooms, because you have to remember, a lot of my elementary teachers, they got an elementary ed degree because they didn't have to take a lot of math. And that's the foundation of my first, second, third. So before they even get to you in college, that's where they started. So really taking ownership as a community, as a math community, of how do we break that barrier for our staff, for our teachers who are in those classrooms, so that they can feel comfortable with the conceptual understanding, so that they can walk in. And I talked at the very beginning, I circled back around to it, those 8 mathematical practices, that's something you can touch and feel. If you're talking about generalizations, if you're talking, it's something you can touch and feel and do something about. Even if I am not good, as I say, I'm not good at math, it's breaking down that stereotype at that younger level. So that way we're able to create a system for all children. And then you're right, Peggy, right now I'm getting in a lot of newcomers to the country who don't speak any English, families don't speak English. At the end of the day, we're having a pivot to figure out how do we help support them, because a lot of my newcomers are really good at math. They might not speak English, but they can certainly, if we provide them supports, they can learn the English part, but they're really good at math. So I think, Nathan, and just addressing that, it really comes down to, we as the math community, we have to take ownership of who's in our classrooms from the baseline all the way up. And you come
Nathan,
to my district any day.
thank you, Donna. Nathan, Donna, Robert, Phil, Cathery, this was wonderful. What an amazing conversation. If this was a podcast, we could close it down and keep talking behind the scenes. Maybe one day. I want to truly say that I am thankful for the conversation today. I've been truly inspired. I hope we can do this again. Equity is the center to my work, but it looks like it's part of what you're all doing. So thank you for what you're doing for our community. I would also like to thank many other people that made this summit a success. I want to start with the 5 panelists that we just heard today. Again, a concerted thank you. Our outstanding keynote speakers, our STEAM professionals, and more than 120 presenters and panelists. They all help us to see clearly the future and the potential for math education in this country. I would be remiss if I did not also acknowledge the generous contributions of the 5 organizations who help us design and plan and bring this IES Math Summit to life. The Council of Chief School State Officers, the Council of Great City Schools, the National Assessment Governing Board, the National Science Foundation, and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Thank you so much. What a tremendously successful team. You were remarkable. I need to give a special thanks to those who had their boots on the ground, the team who actually made all of this work logistically and thinking through all of the many twists and turns and handoffs that had to be made, particularly you, Eunice Greer. You did a wonderful job as a leader and a professional and scientist in your own right. You help us bring together the voices that will hopefully make a difference for children as we move forward. Thank you. And finally, I want to thank all of you for joining us throughout the summit over the past 3 days. I am told that 3,000 participants registered, and we don't know the final numbers, but I am betting that it's going to actually be more than that when we finally look at the numbers. We will provide feedback on any additional information that you need from these provocative presentations that you've heard. comments in the chats and the celebrations that we will send out to those of you who have ongoing conversations. We have all been inspired by the sessions that we've heard over the past 3 days. Thank you again, everyone.